welcome on behalf of the Academy for the Practice of Law. My name is Wouter Kurpershoek, and this coming 20 minutes, my guest will be Grant Dawson. We get to the introduction later. The situation is that we are at this great castle where the Academy is located in the Betuwe in the Netherlands. Excellent location to talk about a topic that deserves a little bit more attention, I would say. Mr. Dawson, can we say Grant, or do you prefer Mr. Dawson?
Grant is more than sufficient.
Okay, you are an American, but you are now a PhD candidate at the Rijksuniversiteit in Groningen. Mm-hmm. How would you say that in English, actually?
Groningen.
Groningen University, I would say. Okay, it's in environmental law. That's also your background, right? Because I Googled you, I researched you, and you have an extensive CV when it comes to environmental law, and also when it comes to the topic of today, the dumping of munitions in the past, maybe also now, and how are we going to deal with it?
Indeed.
Grant, welcome.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. I'm honored to be here.
How did this interest ever start?
Well, as you said, I'm an American lawyer, and I was trained in the United States. But then after doing my qualifications early on, then I quickly wanted to get out there and do other things in other places. And I worked as an assistant attorney general in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands in the Western Pacific Ocean. And then I worked for the United Nations in international criminal law. And then I was very lucky to have an opportunity to work as the principal legal officer of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons.
The OPCW.
Yes, and that's really where the criminal law and the disarmament law and the environmental law aspects that are very close to my professional heart, where they all came together. Because the mandate of OPCW is to verify the destruction of all the chemical weapons. And we're almost done on land with 99.7% of the declared chemical weapons destroyed.
Which is great.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And now it's time to look at the water and to focus on what's underneath the water and to get rid of those, and we haven't actually even started that.
Yeah, that's the topic of this interview. But before sorry for touching the microphone, ladies and gentlemen. But before we get to that, I have one final question, of course. How did you end up in Groningen?
Yes, well, I went to Columbia University for my undergraduate, and I went to Georgetown for my law degree. And I felt like I had more to do academically and to take a deep dive into international environmental law. So since I was in Holland, I decided to look around at all the fantastic universities that are here. And I was very lucky to fall in with a professor who took me on as a PhD student. And I've been working on my PhD in international environmental law for 6 years now. And I'm finishing it up. And I'm hoping to defend maybe the end of this year or the beginning of next year.
What's the specific topic?
It's the legal frameworks that govern the environmental remediation of sea-dumped chemical weapons.
Okay. Again, welcome, because that's exactly what we're going to talk about. How big is the problem?
It's hard to compare it with all the other problems that we have. Climate change, nuclear Armageddon. We still have armed conflicts all over the world, environmental migration.
Pandemics.
Yeah, that's the one too. So it's difficult and sometimes unfair to compare all these things. Like, for example, ocean plastics is a big problem as well. With sea-dumped munitions, maybe I should just back up one moment and say where they came from. So after World War I was signified by the use of chemical weapons for the first time on the battlefield in a large-scale way. And then World War II, there was some chemical warfare in World War II, but not as much as World War I. But they were manufactured. So you ended up after World War II with huge stockpiles of chemical weapons. And no one really knew what to do with them. So they dumped them in the ocean all over the world.
There were a few dumping places, or was it pretty much everywhere?
There's many hundreds of dumping places in every ocean of the world and in many seas of the world, and also in some lakes.
I saw a map with little dots, and there's literally, like you say, hundreds of little dots where then these weapons are being dumped.
Yes.
Or were dumped.
Yes. And some of them were documented and many of them were not documented, which is part of the problem because we don't know where they all are. And when you get out on the ocean on a boat, you really see how big the ocean is.
Vast.
And just the immensity. And that's what they thought. I mean, I can't speak for everyone, but the general sentiment was these things are dangerous. They're on land. We can't leave them on land because they're going to degrade and start hurting people. Super expensive to deal with them in an appropriate way on land. So we'll just dump them in the ocean, and maybe the ocean will just dissolve them and no one will ever see them again.
But was there any research being done before dumping, the type of material that was being dumped? And was it 100 meters or 10 meters underneath the sea levels? Or
to my knowledge, there was no...
They just dumped it.
They just dumped it. And oftentimes like I said, some of it is documented, some is undocumented. And sometimes the orders were to go to very deep water and dump it. But sometimes the personnel would only go so far. Oh, that's far enough. Let's just dump it here.
No one knows.
Yeah, and it's especially an issue in the Baltic Sea because the Baltic Sea is a very shallow sea and it's semi-enclosed, so the water doesn't circulate. It takes decades for the water to circulate in the Baltic Sea. And there's very little interaction between the North Sea and the Baltic Sea because of the different salinities. So what you put in the Baltic stays in the Baltic, and it's very shallow. And so it's they've been down there sometimes for 75 plus years, and they have already leaked.
Who were the perpetrators, or is the word perpetrator not a correct word?
I don't think perpetrator is the right word because this was a different era, and it's difficult to judge them by our modern day standards, especially when we are still dumping stuff into the ocean, like toxic waste and sewage. So it's not like we're perfectly enlightened now and not dumping stuff in the ocean anymore.
Okay, forget the word perpetrator. What countries were responsible for dumping if you make a top 5.
Yeah. Well, after World War II, you had the Potsdam Conference.
Yes.
In 1945. And the Russia and the United States and the UK, they came to an agreement called the Potsdam Agreement. And they decided that they were going to deal with all of the Nazi German chemical munitions and all the other munitions. And then there was a Continental Committee on dumping, and the Continental Committee decided to put this stuff in the Baltic and the North Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. There was also dumping in Hawaii, in Japan, off the coast of Italy. So it's a widespread problem. And we see it as a problem now, but back then it was a solution to them. To how do we get rid of these things in a safe, fast way?
No one gave it a second thought.
No, I mean, I really honestly think that, it was a completely different era with respect to the environment and the environment's ability to absorb all the foreign substances that we're putting into it. It doesn't mean it was a right decision, but it's hard to judge it historically from our standards.
When did people start to realize, hey, we really need to address this situation with all those weapons that we threw overboard? Yeah.
I think this started happening in the 60s because the dumping started after World War I, after World War II. It continued in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and some in the 80s, reportedly. But really, it stopped around the 70s. But in the 1960s, you had people like Jacques Cousteau and Thor Heyerdahl of the Kon-Tiki expedition, who were out there in the ocean, and they found things that they didn't expect, like dead coral reefs or vast spills of oil and trash and all kinds of waste. And they came back and they reported on this, and they hit the red alert, the alarm for, wow, all the stuff that we're dumping into the ocean, guess what? It's not getting absorbed all the time. And the ocean is not an endless sink that we can just put anything into. Once you put it in there, it stays there. And again, this was the 1960s. This was a revelation. People didn't know this or think about this. So they started reporting on this on television and in books. And the United States Congress actually convened in 1970 an international conference on the oceans. And in response to these calls for action, and that conference led to the United States pushing for the London Dumping Convention, which was adopted internationally in 1972. And this was a commonly unsung victory, I think, for humanity. It's like the 1987 Montreal Protocol for the ozone layer, where it's one of these times when we actually pulled together. And I'm not going to say we fixed the ozone problem, because that's complicated and it's actually coming back. But if we hadn't taken action in 1987, we would have had a much bigger problem now. The same is the case in the early 1970s with the oceans. Without the London Dumping Convention and other associated conventions, the ocean, which is in trouble right now, would be in much more trouble. And we might actually be looking at the collapse of the ocean already.
So steps were being taken.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of ocean pollution was vastly reduced by the adoption and the implementation of the London Dumping Convention.
Okay, looking at this whole problem from a legal point of view, there have been treaties. They are still in place? Or do countries still need to follow treaties when it comes to dumping? I mean, what's the legal situation?
Yeah, the legal situation it's pretty straightforward, in that you have we don't need any more law on this issue. We have all the international law that we need. And most of the time, there's also domestic law in place. But from the international law perspective, you have after the London Convention of 1972, for the most part, the munitions were not dumped anymore. But now they're still down there. And then in 1982, 10 years later, you have the adoption of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And you also have a whole host of what's called the Regional Seas Conventions, which is basically a convention on the law of the sea, but for a particular region. And oftentimes these regional conventions have more robust protections than the big UNCLOS, as we call it. And these conventions, they always have an environmental protection provision, which requires states, which voluntarily enter into the treaty, to take active measures to protect and preserve the marine environment. So even if the dumping was done in the past, before you had all of these fancy comprehensive treaties, you now have a very robust and binding treaty regime on the regional and international level that requires states to protect and preserve their marine environment. And as scientists have conclusively proven that these munitions are leaking and will continue to leak in the next decade or so, ultimately with their casings eroding through and releasing all of their contents into the sea, especially the Baltic Sea, states have an obligation to do something about this issue.
Yeah, but what I read is that, for example, the UK, they feel that they are in a different position, or the United States, they think, maybe we need to interpret it in another way. I mean, or is there a consensus? Yes, this is what we need to do. This is what we are going to do. People or a country, no countries, at least that's what I read, want exceptions.
I don't think this is a legal problem. I think it's more of a political, practical challenge. Because in addition to the treaties I just talked about, you also have customary international law, which binds states, all states. And you have the principle of prevention, where states have to prevent environmental harm. You have the principle of cooperation, where states have to cooperate on transboundary environmental challenges like sea-dumped chemical weapons. And then you also have the intertemporal rule of international law, whereby even if something, the intertemporal rule allows the law to evolve and to progress. And so even if something wasn't necessarily expressly proscribed in the past, it can become an obligation of a state because the law has progressed and now they have to apply the new norms to the old legal regime. So all of this is a very clear obligation for action to be taken. And I haven't personally heard any legal resistance to this concept. It's more about politics and money and logistics.
So it's not possible that, for example, when the United States under Trump decided not to abide anymore by the climate agreements in Paris, and then the new government did, that's not how it goes with this specific topic. You're in, you're out, you're in, you're out, whenever there's a new administration?
No, from a legal perspective, no. Because, for example, in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, Part 12 is about protection of the marine environment. And even if you haven't signed the treaty, and even if you haven't ratified the treaty, you have nothing to do with that treaty. Because the marine protection provisions have become customary international law, they bind every single state, whether you're in the treaty or not.
Whether you like it or not.
Right. So legally speaking, there's no issue here. All states are obliged to protect and preserve the marine environment.
Okay, but we're not in a perfect world. So there must be some issues that you're concerned about. Or do you say, well, the only problem is that we just have to start doing it or doing it more?
You hit the nail on the head. We just have to start doing it. And I have some ideas for that.
Please.
So they've been down there. Let's talk about the Baltic, because the EU has funded several joint research projects between governments and research institutes and the military, and this started in the 90s. So there's been a few decades now of research, and the researchers find we really do have a problem in the Baltic. It's going to get worse. And so we need to now pivot from the monitoring. Well, we need to keep on monitoring and doing scientific research, but in addition to that, we need to ramp up the actual remediation activities. And there are several countries in the Baltic region, such as Germany and Lithuania and Poland, that are quite keen to start pulling these things up and doing something about them in the Baltic Sea. Last year in Kiel, Germany, along the Baltic Sea, there was a big conference. And it was a very exciting conference because you had politicians and scientists and engineers in the room. And they were really focused on, okay, now it's time to do something. We've had a lot of research, we've had some conclusions, and now it's time to do something. And everyone was agreed on that. What they were arguing about, which was quite a delightful argument, the arguments at Kiel last September were, which place are we going to do first? Which dump site are we going to tackle first? This one is in a shipping lane. It has more importance. This one is closer to a tourist beach, so that one's more important. That was a fantastic argument to have. And I put the argument in quotation marks because it wasn't really an argument. And the fact that the issue was which one are we going to do first was a fantastic development. And you had the head of the local government saying this is a priority. Also last year, you had the European Parliament, which passed a resolution saying it's time to start to do something about this. And then you have Germany very recently this year saying this is one of our priorities right now. So what you need the governments to get together and they can have a technical level, a regional arrangement. It doesn't have to be a big treaty, just a little arrangement to how they're going to cooperate on this, so everyone's on the same page. And then you need to get the scientists and the engineers and the local authorities to agree on a dump site in the Baltic Sea, and then to put their heads together and do a pilot project. So let's pull up one of these things and see what happens. Or let's leave it where it is and let's deal with it in place. And then after you do that, you do a lessons learned exercise And you just do it very step by step by step, very slowly, and then it can be scaled up over the next decades.
So what you're saying is, or what your suggestion is, make it very practical. Politicians that need to make the decisions, but they need to be in the same room with scientists and engineers. So it's not just empty talk. Yes, we need to solve this problem, but make it practical, make a pilot, learn from it, and continue.
Yes. Yeah. I call it the policy, legal, scientific interface. You need everybody on the same page.
Any other suggestions? Or does it really, this is what it takes?
A lot of people have been thinking about this for a long time, and there's starting to be a coalescence and a consensus around the idea that we just need to pick a site in the Baltic and start.
Is there we say in Dutch, a point at the horizon? And is there a reasonable goal 10 years from now, 20 years from now?
Yes. Well, I think we need to take it step by step, and it takes time to get this going. And so I think we need to responsibly remediate, whether that's under the water or out of the water. That's to be determined by the engineers and the scientists. But I think we need to have a project to remediate one site in the next several years. And we need an end date. And then we need to assess, and then we need to scale it up. And I know it's not very attractive to say this, but this is the work of many, many decades, if not many generations. And we're overdue to start this, and we need to start. It's urgent to start now, and then we're going to leave the job to be finished by our children and our grandchildren. But it's not only a legal obligation, but a moral obligation to fix the mistakes of our collective past.
It's hard not to get depressed these days.
I actually find it very exciting.
Well, and that's, you come across as a very constructive person, but
it's like, don't cry over spilt milk in a way.
I know, but there's so much spilled milk on many tables when it comes to pandemics. Yes. You listed it. There's so many problems.
But if we could actually get this going and make some progress and start to measure it and monitor it and see, okay, like we did with the chemical weapons on the land. That was a massive, massive project, which we started in 1993.
And it worked.
And it worked. And we're almost done with all the declared chemical weapons. So I feel an urgency and an excitement and a hope, and to get this going, and then to see some progress, and then to hand it off to the next generation to keep it going.
Grant, we are almost at the end of this interview. Is there a point that we're still missing that you said, this is really important, this is what I want to still add? Or did we cover pretty much all sides of the topic? Yeah,
I think we covered it. And I would just add that from a legal perspective, we're good. We don't need any more law, any fancy conventions. We don't need to waste our time on that. It's all in place. And now we need to use the law as a tool to motivate everybody else to actually get this project started.
Grant Dawson, thank you so much for coming here. Good luck with your PhD in Groningen. It's almost finished, I understand.
Well, fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. You've been watching an interview organized by the Academy for the Practice of Law, located in Waardenburg in the Netherlands. There's also a website, legalflix.nl. Please go there. There's many other interviews to watch, interviews like this. So please go there and click also on another topic. Thank you for watching. My name is Wouter Kurpershoek. Maybe we'll see each other again.